maybe one of the things that I want to do is I want to print out the value of this variable foo after it's been multiplied by 2. I'll do g question mark v. And what will happen is debugprint will insert a print line. I go and run the script again in my terminal. You'll see that it now prints out debugprint, and here it's printing out at the end the value foo equals 246. If I want to repeat it down here, debugprint supports .repeat, the vim.repeat function, so I can just press dot, and now I get that same printout here. Debugprint is able to remove those statements anyway because it provides a command called delete debugprints. So I can just type delete debugprints and they're all gone.
If you're listening to this as a podcast, remember that it was originally recorded as a video. If you're not following along, you can go to my YouTube channel. My username is linkarzu. And if you want to support me to keep this podcast going, you can donate in Ko-fi. I'm going to leave a link in the description. All right, so let's get started with this chapter then. Hey, Andrew, how's it going?
Hey, it's going good. It's going good. Chris, how's it going with you?
It's going good as well. What time is it where you're at?
It's just gone 20 past 6 in the evening. So, yeah, kind of like beginning to wrap up for the day here. So great time to connect and chat.
Oh, yeah, it's 11:21 a.m. here. So, yeah, thanks for joining. Thanks for your time today. You're going to share with us about your Neovim plugin. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about a Neovim plugin I've built called Debugprint or Debugprint, and maybe kind of give you a little bit of a demo and a flavor, and we can talk a little bit about, what kind of led me to create it in the first place, and, some of my experiences creating Neovim plugins, or specifically this Neovim plugin.
Okay. Is this your first plugin or you have more?
So I actually have another plugin that I maintain as well called wrapping.nvim. I think Debugprint is kind of more interesting. It's certainly more full-featured, and it's kind of where most of my attention goes these days. So that's why I thought we'd talk about that today. But yeah, I have another plugin called wrapping.nvim, which is all to do with kind of switching between soft and hard wrapping automatically. It needs a little bit of love and attention, though. So that's one of the reasons why I thought maybe we'd talk about Debugprint instead today.
Okay, wonderful. You mind showing us your repo just to get an idea on what the plugin is about?
Yeah, sure. So this is the repo you can see here on the screen. You can find it here at Andrew Ferrier /Debugprint.nvim. So essentially, if we kind of just sort of scroll down and take a look at the README, so basically this is just kind of talking about what Debugprint does in the general sense. So really this plugin was kind of born out of some pain that I had in debugging kind of shell scripts and Python scripts and other things. I don't do a lot of kind of like hardcore programming myself anymore. It's not something that I do as part of my day job, but I still do it as kind of a hobbyist from time to time. And so my attitude towards debugging tends to be quite lo-fi and low-tech, right? I don't really use kind of full-blown debuggers. Instead, I like to, use the kind of old school method of sticking in lots of kind of print statements, but that can be a bit tedious and, ends up a bit of a mess. And so the idea of Debugprint was kind of born out of some pain there where, I wanted to work with several different file types and I wanted an easy way to insert kind of debug statements into different kind of types of, programming language or script, such that it would kind of show you where you were. And it kind of sort of started fairly small. I supported only a few languages. It's grown a bit, right? So it now supports kind of up to 40 file types or programming languages and various different variants, including almost all of the standard ones that, folks in the Neovim community tend to use. In my experience, most modern languages, Python, JavaScript, Java, C, Lua, and loads of others. Actually, if you're interested in this plugin, you want to see if it supports the language that you're working with. If you click on this more link, it will take you down the bottom of the README to this feature comparison table. So this feature comparison table actually shows how Debugprint compares to some of its, let's call them competitor plugins or similar plugins. And if you take a look down there, you can actually see down the bottom, I've got a list of all of the different file types that are supported. And of course, I'm showing that Debugprint tends to support kind of almost all of the common ones. But yeah, so that's the basic idea, is it's there to kind of insert kind of debug print lines. If you still don't know what that means, it's probably going to be easier to show by way of a demo, which I guess we'll kind of get to in a second. And over time, it's grown a whole bunch of sort of sophisticated features around highlighting lines, outputting variables. It provides Neovim key mappings for all of the different sort of standard Neovim modes, and a whole bunch of kind of ancillary features as well.
Oh, wonderful. Do you want to quickly give us a demo? Well, not quickly, because that's that's really interesting part of the call. Can you just show us around and give us a better idea on what it does?
Sure, I can. So let me open up a terminal window and I'll just start up Neovim. I tend to use the nightly distribution of Neovim because I'm developing a plugin, and so I tend to like to make sure I've got all the very latest stuff to make sure the plugin is able to stay on the bleeding edge as well. Although, at least for Debugprint, I try to do a reasonable job of making sure it's compatible a few versions back. So I think at the moment, it's still compatible with Neovim version 0.10, for example. But anyway, let me open up just kind of a sort of a sample file, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go actually into the Debugprint repo, Debugprint repo itself, and I've actually got, let me just sort of scroll around. I've actually got a sample Python script here, for example. So you can see this Python script incredibly rudimentary. Even if the folks watching this video don't write Python, I'm sure they'll understand what this does. If you have any kind of programming experience at all, right? So obviously we're just assigning the value 123 to the variable foo, and then we're multiplying the variable foo by 2. Bar is being assigned 456, and then we're just summing those two values together and we're printing out that sum. Obviously a very simple script, right? But just for kind of demonstration purposes. So, let me open up another terminal window, and I will go into my Debugprint repository, and I will find that sample script. Here it is. Let me run that sample script, and here you go. Here's the value. Here's the answer, 702. But let's say that I'm a little bit confused about why it got to the value 702. That wasn't quite what I was expecting. So I want to insert some kind of Debugprint statements into my code to understand what's going on. So maybe one of the things that I want to do is I want to print out the value of this variable foo after it's been multiplied by 2, but before we add it to bar, right? Just so I can see what the result of multiplying 123 by 2 is, right? Again, this is obviously a bit of a contrived example because clearly we can figure that out relatively easily in our heads. But let's say I want to print foo. So what I'll do is I'll do G question mark V. I'll do G question mark V. And what will happen is Debugprint will insert a print line. You can see that it's basically formatted in a sort of standard Pythonic way in this particular case. So it's got this string Debugprint in here. And then you can see towards the end, it's printing out the value of foo. Now, for those of you who are watching the video who maybe haven't written Python before, essentially, this is Python's way of inlining variables into a string using this kind of syntax here where it has these curly braces. So if I go and run the script again in my terminal, sorry, I need to save the script first, that would help. I go and run the script again in my terminal, you'll see that it now prints out Debugprint, and here it's printing out at the end the value foo equals 246. So, not particularly complicated, but the really powerful thing is we can then go and repeat that, right? So if I want to print out the value of foo here, just after I've assigned 123 to it, I can do G question mark V. If I want to repeat it down here, Debugprint supports .repeat, the vim-dap function, so I can just press dot, and now I get that same printout here. Or if I want to print out bar, I can do G quote mark V down here, and I'll print out the value of bar. If I want to print out sum, I can do the same thing down here. So you can see I can very rapidly add Debugprint statements all the way throughout that code. Sometimes I might also want to print something more generic just to understand where I've got to. This code doesn't really have any ifs or loops or kind of conditional logic in it at all. But sometimes you might have some if statements. So let's say, for example, right, let's change this a little bit.
Can you undo and add those debug statements if you just undo?
Yeah, I can. And actually, I was going a bit too quick there, wasn't I, right? Because what I've actually just done is hit the vim undo key. It supports vim undo, right? So I can just hit U to remove the statement that I just added in the same way as you can undo a lot of stuff in Vim. But there are also other ways of doing it. So if, for example, I add a few back in again, right? Maybe I save my file, maybe I even quit Vim and I come back and I open that file up again, right? Maybe I've lost my undo history at this point, depending on how I've set up Neovim, but Debugprint is able to remove those statements anyway because it provides a command called delete debug prints. So I can just type delete debug prints and they're all gone. Right? And basically all it's doing is just doing a simple match on this string debug print here in capitals, and it just literally deletes them from the file, right? So that's kind of all that's going on there. I can actually do some other stuff. So for example, if I type if I type debug print toggle comments debug prints. I don't know where I couldn't find that there for a second, but if I type toggle comment debug prints, one of the things it will do is it will then go through the file and it will actually comment them all, right? So in this particular case, it's using Python comment syntax, which is to put a hash mark in front of each line, but it will do that in a way that makes sense for the language that you're working with, of course, right? So if I now go back to my script and I run it again, I'm not printing anything out. If I go back to my script and I run toggle comment debug prints, it will uncomment them again. So if I save that and now I run my script, now I've got my debug prints back again.
Okay.
Right? So
and in square brackets, you see the line number. Oh, no, it's not the line number. What is that? 1920?
It's not the line number. No. So the way this works by default is that here it's showing test py is the name of the file, and then 3 is the line number. It's the line number when the line was inserted. So Debugprint isn't smart enough to update these statements as you edit the file, right? So if you add lots of lines, the Debugprint statement won't change. That's maybe a little shortcoming, if we're being honest, but that's the line statement when it was inserted. So for example, if I go up here and I insert one just after line 1, you'll see that it's got the line number 1 is part of that debug print statement. The number in the square brackets after debug print is how many debug print statements I've inserted ever since I've started using debug print, right? So obviously I've done more than 22 in my career, right? Because I developed debug print itself, but I actually reset that counter earlier before we started, recording this conversation. But if I quit Neovim and I reopen it again, and I go back to my Python script and I insert some more debug print lines, you should see it carries on from the same number. There you go, 23. If I insert another one, 24. If I insert another one, 25. And this is quite powerful because this means if I've got multiple files that I'm inserting my debug print lines into, I kind of got this just monotonically increasing counter so that it makes it easy to tell them apart when I'm running my script, right? So, if my script consists of multiple classes or files or modules, whatever programming language I'm using, I can easily tell where they came from, right? So this debug print 25, if I'm looking at that and that's really interesting, but I need to go and correlate it back to my source code, all I really need to do is search for the number 25 and then I found it. That's kind of the idea.
So it actually inserts a line and it inserts the print statement, basically, right? So
that's correct. That's correct. And it does this in Python because it knows that we're working with Python. If I were to work with a different programming language, so let's say I go and edit some Lua code instead, right? I write quite a lot of Lua because, of course, Neovim plugins are written in Lua and Debugprint is written in Lua, right? So if I'm working with Lua instead, I can use exactly the same key bindings. So I can do G ? V, Oh, I didn't type that fast enough. I can do G?V, and now it inserts the Lua equivalent, right? So rather than Python code, which of course wouldn't make sense in this context, instead it's using print, and then it's using this vim.inspect syntax here to inspect the value of fit. So it's basically the Lua equivalent of what the Python statement would be. And as I say, it works across 40 odd different programming languages, right? So we have templates that make sense, hopefully, at least, for each of those different programming languages. And you can actually add your own and customize the templates as well if you want to kind of get fancy and advanced. But out of the box, this is kind of how it works.
Okay. And you specify that highlight group. That's why it looks red, the background, right?
Yes. So the way that it works is out of the box, Debugprint is configured. If you're using mini.nvim, I'm sure many of the people watching this video will have come across Mini. It's, one of the most popular, in fact, if not the most popular, kind of like meta plugin in the Neovim ecosystem. So it has a submodule called, I think it's Mini Highlight or something similar. I forget the exact name off the top of my head. But Debugprint works with that. So if you've got Mini installed, it will use that highlighting module to basically highlight any line that contains this exact string, debugprint in capital letters, right? So anywhere that you insert it, it will automatically highlight that. But it's actually mini.nvim that's doing that, and then Debugprint kind of configures it to do that out of the box. If you don't use Mini and you're not interested, and you've never installed it, you're not interested in installing it, you won't see that red highlight. It will just appear like any other code. So that's just a convenience feature, and you can turn it off in the Debugprint options as well if you don't like it.
Okay, but it does not install that Mini plugin as a dependency. You have to add it manually, right? If you want the highlight.
That's right. Well, the way that this works, if you have a look in the README for Debugprint, just going back to the Git repo, the way that this works, if we go down here, you'll see that the example that I give for installing Debugprint, which is for that lazy nvim plugin manager, by the way, which I think is probably the most commonly used one. Here I'm listing mini.nvim as a dependency, and it says needed for line highlighting, but as it says there, it's optional, right? So if you don't include this dependency, that's fine. You just won't get that line highlighting, basically. So it's kind of your choice. And the reason I implemented it that way is because implementing that line highlighting is actually not straightforward. I kind of looked at doing it myself as part of Debugprint, but doing it in a way that's reliable and accurate across all of the different file types is quite tricky. So I decided to outsource that job basically to mini.nvim. As an aside, I mean, if there are other line highlighting plugins that folks watching this video are using and they're interested in getting Debugprint to work with that, I'd certainly be interested in hearing from people. So feel free to open up an issue on Debugprint if you wanted to work with other similar plugins. But I started with mini.nvim just because it's probably the most popular one, at least the most popular one I'm aware of.
Okay, wonderful. So it's installation, it's just this, just basically specify the plugin repo, plugin name, dependencies, version, in case they want to stick to a specific version. Otherwise, you're using latest, I guess, right?
Yeah, so this is all you need by default. If you want to use all the default values, all the default options for Debugprint, this is kind of all you need. You can put in some custom options in here. I'll show that in a second. They're kind of sort of listed further down. And then these are actually just sort of standard features of the lazy plugin manager. So this is just basically this lazy equals false is required to make that line highlighting that we were just talking about work. If you don't have that set up, it won't work until you do the first Debugprint command for reasons that are a bit fiddly and too complicated to explain here. But that's why I have lazy equals false in there. And then, yes, this basically makes it use the stable version. So the way that I've been developing this plugin, at least, which seems to be following the sort of standard conventions in the Neovim kind of plugin ecosystem, is I give my plugins tags and version numbers in GitHub, right? So, using the way that lazy works, basically it will install the latest tag. And then from time to time, I will create a new version based upon all the new features and fixes and stuff on the head of my main branch, and then that becomes the new version. But basically, if you're not that interested in the Neovim plugin development aspect and you just want to use this, then version equals star is almost certainly what you want, because it just gives you the latest stable version of Debugprint, basically.
Okay, I have a question. What if there's someone that encounters a programming language that is not supported? Can they submit PRs? Do you accept PRs, or how does that work?
Absolutely. I'd be very keen to accept PRs, although you can also just configure it for yourself locally. That works too. So if you go down in the repo, there's a whole bunch of sections here, by the way, that talk about all of the standard key mappings and kind of how they work. I've sort of shown the one for variable in particular, but there's also just plain debugging, and then there's surrounds and other things that I haven't sort of shown yet. But anyway, that's all listed in there. And then there's a whole section that talks about all of the different customizations and options that you can do. But if you scroll down a little bit further, all the way, where is this listed? All the way down the bottom, you'll see that there's the ability to add custom file types. So if you click on that, that takes you to what I call the showcase. So this configuration showcase file, this is basically like an addition to the README. And what I'm trying to do in here is capture kind of sort of more advanced tips and tricks for Debugprint, or kind of more unusual customizations for folks who want to use stuff, that's kind of a little bit just beyond the kind of out-the-box functionality. And one of the things in there, as you can see, is kind of modifying or adding your own file types, right? So basically the way that you do this is you kind of sort of set up this simple little structure in Lua, locally in your Neovim configuration. Basically, there's a mechanism where you specify, both the sort of left-hand side of the print statement before the auto-generated Neovim bit, and then the right-hand side bit of that print statement. And you express that in whatever makes sense for the programming language you're working with. And then you kind of pass that into the setup mechanism, the setup a function that you're setting up Debugprint with in lazy or whatever programming language you want to use. So you can just do that locally in your own Neovim configuration if you want to. But if you figure one out for a programming language that you think other people would want to use, I'm absolutely very keen and happy for people to open, I say issue here, but I'm also obviously pull request is fine too, right? Would be very keen and happy to hear from anybody who's using maybe a language that's a little bit unusual, that isn't part of the sort of standard 40 that are kind of sort of currently supported by Debugprint. More than happy to kind of sort of add those in and maintain those. The configuration for each programming language is not particularly tricky to do. As long as you know how to program in that language and you know how to print out a string, you can pretty much figure this out, right? So yeah, happy to. And if anyone's kind of struggling with this process, because it can be a little bit fiddly, especially if you've never written any Lua before, again, happy to help you figure it out. If you want to open up an issue on the repo, I can talk to people about that.
So that makes it very flexible. Then you don't have to wait on the PR to be accepted and all that. So you can just add it yourself locally, and you're good to go.
That's right. And part of the reason I did this was also because I thought that there may be circumstances where certain people want local customizations that, we don't typically have as part of, the sort of standard Debugprint. I'll give you a good example. One of the things that has come up a lot, especially for folks who write JavaScript or TypeScript, which is obviously a pretty common language these days, is that some people want to use console.info rather than console.warn, which is what Debugprint uses by default. There's a good reason why Debugprint uses console.warn. I've been through a conversation. Like, if you're really interested in all the gory details and you're into your TypeScript, you can go and read this issue here where we sort of debated it back and forth. But if you still don't like, the answer that I gave, you don't like the fact that it uses console.warn rather than console.info, you can just change that. And I've got an example snippet of how to do that, here, right? So both folks can have their own local customizations for Debugprint that are more than just more than just what kind of comes out of the box if they want to do.
Oh, okay. So you specified for different file types, for 4 different file types, the same print statement, right?
That's right. That's right. So that's what I'm doing here, because the way that JavaScript and TypeScript work in Neovim is that there are 4 different Neovim file types, right? JavaScript, TypeScript, JavaScript React, and TypeScript React for those folks writing React.js. In fact, there may even be more variations than that, but off the top of my head, those are the ones I'm aware of. So that's kind of how I've expressed it there. So the way these file types work is these are Neovim file types. So depending on how familiar you are with Neovim, if you take a look at your Neovim window, I've got a custom status line, so this may look a little bit different from how other folks have got their Neovim set up. But every Neovim file has a file type. Lua is obviously Lua, right? Python is obviously Python, but some of them are a little bit less obvious. I guess JavaScript React is one of those. But yeah, these are Neovim file types basically.
Okay, wonderful. You want to show us other stuff that you use the plugin for? You want to keep demoing stuff? Yep.
Sure. So there's a few kind of like slightly more unusual features. Let me see what we can find. So let me just go back to my script.lua. So one of the things I added relatively recently at someone's request is what I call the surround feature. So if I do G $SP, it will actually insert 2 debug print lines, one above and one below. That's actually, it sounds a little bit weird, but it's the kind of thing, if you do this type of debugging a lot because you're a bit lazy like me and you like to do it this way rather than using a proper debugger, that can actually be quite useful, right? Because maybe bar equals 2 takes 10 seconds to run. I mean, obviously it doesn't in this case, right? But maybe it's a long running operation, or you're kind of surrounding a function invocation or something like that, and you want a print statement directly before it runs and then a print statement directly after it runs. So you can do that, and then that's a kind of an atomic thing. So if I undo that, they both disappear at the same time. I can also do the same thing with the variable variation. So I'm not sure how well I explained this earlier, but Debugprint basically has kind of 2 standard keystrokes. One is G $P. That just inserts a sort of standard print line with no variable content in it. So all this is doing is basically just saying, after the line where you set bar equals 2, that's where I've got to. If I actually wanted to print the value of bar, I do G $V. Oh, I didn't do that fast enough. G $V. And now I actually get the print out the current value of bar, right? Which in Lua is bar equals, and then we've got this vim inspect bar. And then there's the surround variations on both of those. So if I do G $SP, then I get the plain version, and if I do the V, then I get the V version. So that's kind of one of the sort of slightly more unusual features. I'm actually just going to go back to the README here to prompt myself to see what else there is. So one of the things to be aware of is that there are key bindings for many different modes. So everything I've been showing you so far, I've been doing in normal mode, but you can also work, for example, in visual mode. So let's say I, for example, visually select foo here, right? So I've selected that variable. If I now do G $V, it will print out the value of foo below. Okay. If I undo that, if I instead visually select bar and do G $V, it will print out the value of bar instead. And for some languages, I can even do expressions. So let's say I'm interested in the value of foo plus bar. I can select that whole thing, and then I can do G $V, and now I get foo plus bar equals vim inspect foo plus bar, right? Obviously, in this case, I know we've just assigned it to banana, right? So that's a bit of a fake example, but you get the idea, right? You can also do what are called operator pending expressions. So this is quite, let's call it this way, it's quite an old school Vim thing, right? Like not everyone who uses Neovim necessarily does this, but it's a very powerful feature to know in general, not just for Debugprint, but Debugprint supports it too. So if I do G $O, I have to do this quite quickly because the way I've set up my timeout in my Neovim configuration. But if I do d?o inside word, it will now produce, it will now do the value of foo, right? If I hover over bar and I do g?? inside word, oops, excuse me, I didn't do it fast enough, g?o inside word, it will do the same thing for bar.
So you don't have to select the word in visual mode before, right?
Correct. In fact, if the folks watching this haven't come across operator pending mode before, I can show you a simpler example that doesn't even use debug print. If I'm sitting on the word foo and I do diw, delete inside word, it's basically going to delete the word foo from my Neovim buffer. So that's got nothing to do with debug print. That's just standard Vim Neovim behavior, right? It's basically using text objects. So inside word, IW means inside the word I'm currently on. So if I do diw, it deletes it. If I do CIW, it switches into insert mode and allows me to replace it. So that's standard kind of Vim behavior, but Debugprint extends on this by having g?o inside word and allows me to kind of print it out like that. So if you're the kind of person who likes to use that kind of Vim interaction, you can do it that way. If you don't like that, you can do it with visual mode instead. I think these days, my experience is that folks in the Neovim community are more, especially folks who maybe have come from another editor like VS Code or whatever, they're more familiar and more comfortable with using visual mode. That's fine. You can do that too. That works. So, whatever you prefer, basically. But Debugprint supports all of these.
Okay. What happens if I have three variables declared like foo, bar, and banana, and I select all of them in visual mode, and then I bring debug print, like the three of them are selected?
Well, you may or may not, depending upon the language you're using, get something invalid, right? So debug print is not that smart about understanding what you've actually selected, right? It just treats it in a relatively naive way. So, for example, if I select this whole line, banana equals foo plus bar, and I do g?v, I'll get a line that looks like this: banana equals foo plus bar equals, well, that's just a string, so that will be fine, right? Because it's just printing out a string. And then it'll do vim.expect banana equals foo plus bar. This is a syntax error in Lua because you can't have an equal sign in the middle of an expression like this. So that won't work, right? But Debugprint doesn't understand that those variables. It's not that smart. It's just looking at this as text, basically. So it does rely on you having a little bit of understanding of the programming language you're working in and what you're doing. But in general, to be honest, I don't tend to use it for anything that sophisticated anyway. I'm just generally doing this, right?
You want something
out the value,
right?
Exactly. That's kind of the idea, right? So I'm not trying to be too smart about this. In some languages, but not all of the ones that it supports. So Lua, as an example, Neovim is a little bit smarter, and it tries to use tree sitter, which is, again, for anyone who's watching the video who's not familiar, tree sitter is one of the more modern Neovim features that allows Neovim to kind of like build up an internal tree of a language and kind of understand its different features. So for some languages, I think maybe 3 or 4, Debugprint actually uses tree sitter to try and slightly more smartly understand what a variable is. So, but for some other languages, it does not. It really depends on what you're working with.
Okay, wonderful. So I guess that covers the demo. Do you want to show something else before we get to know you a little bit more?
I don't think so. There is one other feature that may be interesting. I'm actually cheating them through my own README to remind myself all the different features. So there is one other potentially interesting feature. Again, it's maybe sort of slightly more advanced, traditional Neovim-y thing. But one of the things you can do is you can put the contents of your Debugprint expressions into registers. So I'll give you an example. If I'm sitting on foo here, for example, I can do quote a g g?v. Nothing appears to have happened apart from the fact you can see down the bottom it says written variable debug line for foo to register a. And then I can do the same thing for B, except this time I'm going to do capital A register, which means it's going to append to the register. So I'm going to do quote capital A G question mark V, and it's appended bar to register A. So at this point, all Neovim is doing is writing stuff into standard, all Debugprint is doing is writing stuff into standard Neovim registers. But the reason why I've done all that is because maybe I actually want to insert those debug lines all the way down here. So what I can now do is quote AP, and now bingo, and now I've got my two registers further down in my two debug print lines further down in my script. So I'm printing out foo and I'm printing out bar all the way down here. Right, and this is quite useful if, like, maybe I've got a whole bunch of variables here and I want to print out all of them, but I want to do it kind of sort of further down in the script or something like that. So that's occasionally useful, but again, it's a slightly more kind of advanced thing. You know, folks watching this video, if you're kind of deeply into your Vim or your Neovim, you know, you might have come across, you know, different named registers and be using them like this. Many folks just use a simple kind of, you know, clipboard, right? So it really depends on, you know, how you tend to use your Neovim. If you don't want to use that feature, don't use it, but it's there if you need it.
Okay. And since they're just print statements, you can move them from, you could move all of them from where they put it to the bottom of the file.
Absolutely. Once the print statements are inserted, there's nothing special about them. They're just text in your script, same as anything else. They're being highlighted in red because they happen to have this phrase debug print in them. Although you'll notice if I delete, for example, this T, immediately the red highlight disappears, right? So they're just text in your script, right? I can delete this line, I can move it up here, I can modify it, right? You know, I can put whatever rubbish I want in there. Like, you know, it's just part of your script at this point.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, and moving on to other type of questions. When did you start with Neovim to get to get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. Well, I was actually taking a look at my dot files, my config, kind of the other day, you know, just mooching around, taking a look, you know, in preparation for our discussion. So I think I actually started with Vim, not Neovim, right? So I've been using Vim for quite some time, I think since 2010, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess I've been using Vim and Neovim for getting on for 15 years now. I don't remember when I exactly made the transition from Vim to Neovim. I think it must have been around about Neovim version 0.3, 0.4, something like that. I was kind of sort of watching the project from afar. And initially, I guess I didn't quite understand what the guys were trying to do with Neovim, but, you know, then it became a little bit, more obvious, and it sounded really interesting. So I kind of sort of took the plunge and I converted. I had a vim-rc file, which is like the Vim equivalent of your Neovim configuration, which was quite long, and it was written in VimScript. And for the folks on the call who maybe have only ever used Neovim, you know, VimScript is an interesting language, right? But it's a little bit painful to work with compared to Lua. So in one sense, I really like the fact that they made the transition to Lua. But yeah, I took the plunge and I basically converted that vim-rc into Lua, and I kind of not really looked back. I mean, I tried to maintain a dual config for a while, but that was even more painful, and I just kind of gave up on that in the end and kind of went the whole hog into the Neovim ecosystem, and I just really like it. But yeah, so I guess if you count Vim as well, about 15 years, but, you know, maybe 7 or 8 years in Neovim, something like that. I don't know the exact time.
Oh, so that's your main text editor. What about other editors? Yeah. What are your thoughts on Emacs, for example, or other ones?
So Emacs, I kind of dabbled with Emacs a while ago. Somewhere I still have an Emacs configuration, but it's probably getting on for like 20 years old at this point. I mean, I never used it. Like it's probably in my dot files somewhere or something. But yeah, I've never used that. And I remember Emacs being quite painful. I could never really kind of get to grips with all the list-based configuration. And the slightly more serious answer, I mean, these days, yes, I use Neovim for almost everything. Occasionally, I've dabbled with using things like VS Code, or I tried out Cursor the other day, which is, one of the more AI-enabled, sort of VS Code forks, I guess. And yeah, I quite like using that kind of thing for its more kind of like visual view, right? So, if someone's given me a repository of some code or something and I want to kind of read it and get to grips with it, sometimes using VS Code can be handy, just because, I don't know, it's the graphical nature of it somehow makes it a little bit easier to kind of navigate around. But for my own little pet projects and my own dabbling around and so on, it's almost exclusively Neovim.
Oh, okay. And what are your thoughts on distribution? I guess you have your own configuration, right?
Yeah, I think I kind of go back and forth on that, right? Like, I think distributions, like I think Lazy Vim is pretty popular these days. As an example, I wouldn't claim to know all the distributions very well, but I know Lazy Vim well enough because I've kind of sort of seen it referred to on, Reddit and stuff like that. It's not for me personally, because part of the fun for me is kind of like dabbling in the details, and I guess distributions kind of abstract some of that away from you. But for a lot of people, particularly people who just need to use Neovim to get their work done, like, I can completely understand why they want a distribution, and I think it is a good way of getting people who are new into the Neovim ecosystem into that kind of thing. So it's easy to be snobby about these things, but I don't think there's anything wrong with distributions if that's what works for people, then use it, right? Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Do you want to share a little bit about you and where can people find you?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in the technology industry now for about like 20 years or so. I kind of sort of started out as a coder, as a developer. I've kind of like sort of, moved roles a few times. I no longer code on a daily basis. I now kind of like work as a consultant in a political organization, right? Still focused on technology, but I don't code on a daily basis. It's more about, kind of advice and kind of sort of facilitation and things like that. But I've always been of the opinion that, like, if you're going to be in technology, you should still, fundamentally, you should still know how to code on some level, or like at least know enough to be dangerous, right? Like when other people are talking about technology, what the general things they're referring to. And I find that just kind of keeping my hand in and that stuff in my spare time is one of the ways of doing that. And so that's one of the reasons why I maintain things like Debugprint in my spare time, just because I kind of find it fun, and I find it a way to, like, dabble in programming and at least make sure that I still know approximately what I'm talking about. I can do things like I use test-driven development, for example, for Debugprint, right? So it's just a way of like teaching myself. Again, I'm not going to claim I'm a guru in that stuff. Maybe they're not the very best tests, but they're good enough, and it teaches me a little bit about some of the principles, so that when other people are talking about it, I know enough. At least that's what I like to think.
Okay, wonderful. YouTube, no, right? You don't have a YouTube channel or anything like that?
I don't have my own YouTube channel yet. I've considered it. This is probably one of my first, like, proper being on YouTube experiences, which is one of the reasons I was keen and excited to talk to you today. So no, I don't have a YouTube channel on my own, but I follow at least some of the kind of Neovim core folks, like TJ DeVries, for example, and stuff like that on YouTube. And I've definitely thought about doing that. Whether I would do it in a development focused way or about something like Neovim, I don't know yet. But not yet.
Okay, wonderful. How has the experience been with the plugin? How has the open source experience been?
Pretty good. The reason I started doing it was I thought, like, it's like many of these things, it's like scratching your own itch, right? Like, I found myself wanting to put these debug statements in stuff I was doing, and so I was like, well, let me create a little script. And so I created a little script, and then I thought, oh, well, actually, maybe if I just put a little bit of effort into generalizing that, I could, release it on GitHub. And so I did. But then, of course, people start saying, well, wouldn't it be great if it could do this? And wouldn't it be great if it could do that? And so, it kind of sort of spirals over time. But it is rewarding. It's nice. I love it when people open up issues and pull requests, because it actually kind of sort of shows that people are kind of interested and engaged with it. And that kind of motivates me. So to anyone watching this, by the way, if you're interested and you want me to keep maintaining Debugprint, I'm not there for the money or sponsorship or anything like that. I just kind of want to do it for the fun of it. So, if you want me to keep doing that, then by all means, please engage, sort of send me issues or pull requests or things like that. I'm always more than happy to have those conversations with people. So in general, I found it really positive. I wouldn't say I've had any major problems, right? Occasionally you have probably the trickiest thing I've had so far, and Debugprint isn't a very high-profile plugin, so I guess, I probably don't get that many issues and so on. There's been one or two where I've had issues where people are asking for something that you think, well, that's quite a good idea, but I need to think about how we generalize that to make sure that it's useful to a lot of people, right? Rather than necessarily, I'll give you an example. I think someone opened an issue, I forget the specifics, but someone opened an issue saying something like, well, wouldn't it be great if I could have an emoji in my debug print statement, right? So I can see them clearly. And I'm like, yeah, that is great. But what actually I should really do is generalize it so that you can change the tag to anything you like. So actually, by the way, it doesn't have to be debug print. You can configure that. You can set it to a different string if you want in the configuration options. So just little things like that, where it's like, someone makes a request, but I want to implement it in a way that's generally useful to everybody, not, kind of super specific. So it's basically kind of like trying to make the right architectural choices. I know architecture is probably a very fancy word to use about something so simple as a plugin like this, but yeah, I would say in general it's been very positive, and most people seem to engage in good faith. Like I mentioned earlier, there's one or two other plugins that, quote, compete with Debugprint, but, I've been in touch with maintainers of both of those, and, we have some healthy competition, let's put it that way, I guess, right? Neither of them seem to, I think one of them was aware of Debugprint and the other one wasn't, but, no one, we see that as I'll implement something and maybe they go and implement something similar, or I decide that feature isn't right for Debugprint or whatever, right? But, it's just a way of everybody, learning from each other, basically. That's the way I see it.
Okay, wonderful. And what file explorer do you use on Neovim?
In Neovim, I don't know if you count it as a file explorer even. I just use oil. So I don't know how familiar you are with that, but for folks who haven't used it, so this is oil. It's not a tree style kind of file explorer like NerdTree or whatever. It's basically an extension of, if you've ever used the inbuilt netrw, or if you've used Vinegar, which was kind of the previous incarnation of this concept before oil came along. It's basically, just basically a way of making your file directories editable, right? So, I can navigate here. Here is my debug print repository. If I go up to the doc directory and press enter, then it changes into the doc directory. I'm just pressing the minus key to go up in the file tree. But it's quite powerful because you can use it in a Neovim-like way, right? So let's say I want to rename my README file from README to README Andrew. I can literally just edit this, and then when I save this file buffer, bingo, the file is renamed, right? So to me, this meshes quite well with the Neovim way of using things, and I'm quite happy with it. It's relatively simple, but it does what I need it to.
Oh, okay. Since you like that type of file manipulation, have you heard about this mini.files?
I have. I tried to use it briefly. I didn't put very much time into it, if I'm honest. But I'm not that familiar with it.
I don't know. I like thinking of it like a mixture between oil and NeoTree, because you kind of get like a tree, right? You can get all of your motions, right? I can yank this, paste it somewhere else. I can delete it using Vim navigation, basically. But I get a preview. I have the preview on the right. I have like these sort of little Windows, right? To navigate in my directory. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. So when I am quite a terminal kind of geek. Like I tend to do a lot of stuff in the terminal, and I do tend to use the LF file manager quite a lot, which is kind of similar. Similar, I guess, to Ranger, if people have ever used that, or there's one or two other similar ones. I forget the name of all of them. But yeah, so I use LF quite a lot, right, which is kind of similar. It enables me to kind of navigate up and down through file trees. For whatever reason, I use that independently of Neovim. I don't quite know why. I've actually set up a Neovim key binding that allows me to open that in a separate window, but yeah, that's what I tend to use. But I will probably give mini files a go at some point. I use many of the other mini sub plugins, I guess I should call them. I don't know what the official name for them is, but so I use some of the other ones, but I've never really tried mini file.
Okay. Now moving on to something else. Well, let's just discuss Neovim right now, and then we can touch on the other subjects. So the color scheme that you're using,
I think I just used gruvbox. If I remember, I think I just used gruvbox if I remember rightly. Yeah, just gruvbox. I'm not majorly into like changing my colors. I'm not. There's a whole community of making their Linux distribution look super fancy, and that's not for me. So I spend my time doing. So I just use gruvbox, which I think is pretty old color scheme at this point, but it works for me.
Okay, you prefer a light color scheme?
No, I actually have it set up to switch. So it switches in the evening to dark, and then it switches back again in the morning to light.
Okay.
Yeah. I spent probably more time than I should do on getting that working in my terminal and in Neovim and so on. Like you can see, I've actually got this like state file where it sort of maintains whether it's light or dark, and it kind of automatically switches within Neovim. If we stay on this phone call long enough, you may even see it happen automatically because it's getting on for 7:10 in the evening here. So it'll probably go dark in about, I don't know, an hour's time, something like that. But yeah. So, like I said, I probably spent more time than I really should do on kind of getting that working, but yeah, it was a bit of fun. So,
Okay. And do you use any tool to take notes, like Obsidian or something? Or
at work, I use a Mac. You can see I'm using Linux here, but yeah, at work I use a Mac, and so most of my note taking is in that context. So I just use iCloud Notes, which I know is not particularly kind of hackery, but it works fine for me because I have an iPhone and a MacBook, so that's what I tend to use. Yeah. I guess for personal stuff, maybe occasionally I'll just write stuff into a Markdown document, but I mean, that's about as sophisticated as it gets.
Nothing fancy. Okay.
Nothing fancy.
What tool do you use to push to versioning control?
So most of my version control, again, because I'm a bit of an old school guy, I either tend to work with Git commands directly from the command line, or sometimes I will work with TIG. So for folks who haven't come across TIG before, so this is my .files repo, for example, which is public, by the way. So if anyone's interested in looking at my .files, it's part of my Git repo, part of my GitHub account. But yeah, so I tend to use TIG, which is just like command line TUI, basically. So, you can just go along and see all of the different changes. I can see what's staged. I can stage stuff. I can unstage stuff. I can commit, things of that nature, right? So that's basically what I use probably like 95% of the time.
TIG, okay. I hadn't heard about that.
TIG,
so it's like a terminal tool. CLI tool.
Yeah, it's a terminal tool. It's very, very, very common. You'll find it in all the standard Linux distributions and stuff like that as a package. But yeah, TIG, basically.
Okay.
I mean, I have a few very minor customizations, but mostly I just use it kind of as it is out of the box.
Okay, wonderful. What are your thoughts on Tmux? Do you use it?
I sometimes use it, to be honest, mostly just as like, I don't really tend to use it like for kind of splitting up windows, because I use the i3 window manager, which is what you'll see on my screen right here, which kind of does a lot of similar stuff, right? So for example, I can kind of split my windows up like that, and then I can create stuff, and I can kind of drag it around with my mouse and rearrange it like that. So that's how I tend to use that. The only time I ever really use Tmux is I've got a few like one or two kind of little home mini servers. So if I want to run something on one of those, I'll log into it, create a Tmux session so that I can start something long running, like a backup or whatever, disconnect from it, and then come back the next day and kind of reconnect it, which obviously you can't really do with your window manager. So that's the main thing I tend to use Tmux for. But when I'm just mucking around on my laptop like this, I'll just split windows using i3. I maybe it's just me, but I always found all the Tmux key bindings a bit kind of confusing. I could never really remember which control B prefix thing does what. So I use it in a really basic way where I just attach and detach from sessions most of the time.
Okay, wonderful. So you mentioned that you use Linux, right? In your personal computer, Linux. At work, you use Mac. So
yeah,
why do you choose Linux? Have you used that all the time?
Yeah. So let's see. Well, like in my professional life, I mean, 15 years ago, I used to use Windows, and then at some point I had the opportunity to switch to Mac, and I never looked back because for me, like the Mac at work makes sense because it's like that nice mix between, it's a bit hackery and customizable, and I can still get terminals and stuff, but it just basically works out of the box, right? Which is why I need it work, because I need to get my work done. But at home, I tend to use Linux because obviously it's a bit more customizable. Well, it's a lot more customizable, and I can fiddle with it and I can play with it. But obviously that also comes with the risk of, breaking stuff too, right? So in my personal life, I use Linux. And I mean, I've used Linux again, certainly probably for about 20 years at this point, off and on in various different ways. Initially just through servers. So, I've kind of had the home server for quite some time in various different forms. Like headless servers, basically, just to kind of, run backup jobs and file shares and other stuff at home. But yeah, more recently, the last 10 years or so, I've started using it on my personal desktop, my personal laptop as well. And yeah, I'm using Arch Linux here at the moment as a desktop. Again, just because it sort of strikes that nice combination between being reasonably easy to use, but also quite customizable, I guess. And then I use Debian on my servers just because it's nice and stable.
Okay.
Yeah, just because it's nice and stable and reliable, and it doesn't break very easily. Basically,
that's the one that I use as well. First person that tells me Debian on servers, and that's the one that I love. Like Ubuntu, right? If I could just go to the grandfather of the.
I went through a phase of using Ubuntu on my servers, and I kind of regretted it because I realized at some point, I don't know about Ubuntu on the desktop. I think Ubuntu did a lot of good things for the desktop. Not some bad things too, but a lot of good things. But on servers, I realized that Ubuntu server is basically more or less just rebranded Debian, but with some things that are kind of broken and annoying. And so after a while, I realized there really wasn't any point in using it, especially for a home user like me. I'm not interested in formal support contracts and all that kind of stuff. I just want to use it as a hobbyist, right? So, Debian is just plain and simple, and it works, and it's stable, and it generally doesn't break, right? I just use Debian. And I've been using Debian since version 2, I think, or maybe version 3 on a server. I still remember at university, 20 years or so ago, having a sort of a server in my dorm room, with Debian installed, Debian 2 or Debian 3, I think, installed on it. And, it's stable then, and then it's still stable now. So, yeah, I really like it. I think it's a great project.
Yeah, I love Debian too. The only thing is that there's more documentation for Ubuntu, but you can find your way around in Debian as well, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the stuff is very similar, right? Because Ubuntu is based on Debian, so a lot of the time you can kind of copy commands or adapt them or whatever. But yeah.
Okay, what are your thoughts on Windows?
I mean, these days, for me personally, it's mostly irrelevant, right? I mean, I think, I went through a phase, when I was a kid, I had quite a lot of Windows, machines and so on. And so I went through a phase of customizing them a lot and fiddling with them a lot. That was back in Windows 95 days and things like that. But I mean, these days, like whenever I've used Windows recently, which is not very often at all, it tends to be when I'm helping someone else out who's got Windows on their laptop, and I'm the techie. I'm sure all us techie people have the same thing, right? Like someone comes along and is like, "Can you help me fix my laptop?" And so I'll try, and often I can fix the problem, but like my experience is it just seems to be overcomplicated for like simple things. And I just don't really see that it has any notable advantages at this point beyond, using a Mac or, maybe even using Linux Mint, for example, right? I have one or two family members who are not very technical, and I tend to install Linux Mint on their laptops because it's just nice and straightforward and easy to use, kind of out of the box, without really needing to be techie or kind of understand what a terminal is or any of that kind of nonsense, right? So, if I have a family member who's like, "Can you sort out my laptop for me?" 90% of the time, that's get rid of Windows, install Linux Mint, and they can't really tell the difference because it's kind of pretty similar, right?
Yeah.
Like, for all the things that it matters for them, at least, like, it's pretty similar.
Which is browser basically,
which is a browser and maybe an email client, and things like that, right?
Okay. Window Manager, you mentioned that you use i3, right? Is that what you started with?
No, I think I went through a phase of transitioning across to using i3 about 3 or 4 years ago, something like that. I've used loads of window managers over the years. I can't even remember what I was using before that, probably some GNOME thing, I think. But I just quite like the idea of using the keyboard a lot. Like, I sort of went through a phase of trying to learn keyboard shortcuts for loads of stuff just because it makes you so much more efficient. And the nice thing about using i3 is like I'm sitting here and I'm barely touching my mouse a lot of the time, right? Like, I use my mouse in my browser, I suppose. That's probably the one place where I use it quite a lot. But, if I'm doing stuff on terminals, I can just open my terminal, I can open another terminal, I can change the splits around, I can do all kinds of stuff. Like, I'm just touching the keyboard. I'm not even, touching the mouse at this point. So that's one of the things I like about i3. And I know there's similar window managers to i3. I'm actually blanking on the names right now, right? There are other kind of sort of BSP type window managers like that, but I don't know. For some reason, when I was looking, I kind of settled on i3, and it does everything I need it to. So that's kind of what I stick with.
Okay, wonderful. Are you a single monitor person or multiple monitors?
Well, multiple monitor today, just because it's easier for us to do our recording like this. Yep. But no, generally I'm a single monitor guy, right? So, I'm lucky enough to have a nice big monitor on my desk at home, but I also have a relatively small desk, so it's just the one monitor. And generally that works for me. I've kind of dabbled in the past in years past with kind of having multiple monitors, but for me at least, I find it kind of annoying, like stretching my neck and stuff. So I just tend to stick with one. Okay. One big one is kind of my approach.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, me too. Single monitor. I used a big TV in the past, but no, it was not efficient. Yeah. I prefer to have only one. Yep. What terminal emulator do you use?
At the moment, I use Kitty. There are lots of similar terminal emulators out there. I know that. I'm not like super wedded to Kitty, but I've spent a little bit of time kind of customizing it for my needs. We've kind of sort of, and I just like the way that Kitty does kind of quite a lot of nice stuff out the box. Like, it's quite standards compliant these days, so it does all the kind of slightly more advanced stuff. But it also supports a whole bunch of like rich features. So yeah, I just tend to use Kitty.
Okay, wonderful. Do you use a special keyboard?
No, not particularly. No, I just got a standard UK keyboard, which is where I am, and that's what I use.
Okay. Use which layout, QWERTY or something different?
Oh yeah, QWERTY. Yeah. No. I sort of vaguely dabbled with the idea of trying Dvorak or one of these alternative layouts, but the problem I find is you can never interact in the real world by doing that, because you do it on your laptop, but then as soon as you go to someone else is like, "Oh, can you help me fix a problem on my laptop?" and you try and type something in, I'm just like, that's just going to. my brain is not big enough to cope with both of those things simultaneously. So yeah, no, I just stick with standard QWERTY. I know it's supposed to be more efficient keyboard layouts, but I just haven't got the patience to deal with learning one of them.
Okay. Do you use AI? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so interesting. So yeah, I use AI a bit in my job, right? Because I'm kind of a consultant, sort of technology consultant in my job. So sometimes I'll use it to like research issues or things like that. But it's like probably more relevant and interesting to this video and the folks watching it. How do I use it in kind of like more sort of programming kind of, or kind of like development type context? It's interesting. So I haven't integrated it with Neovim. I tried one or two Neovim AI plugins to interact with things like ChatGPT and stuff like that. It's probably just me being impatient and not spending enough time on it. I haven't yet found any that I like. I'm quite unusual, I think, in the Neovim community in that I really hate autocomplete. I keep trying it, but I just can't get with it. So I kind of turn it off. And, I think a lot of that AI stuff works quite well in a autocomplete context. What I will do, though, sometimes is I'll go to ChatGPT, for example, and I'll just be like, can you write me a snippet of code to do X, Y, Z? And then I'll like copy and paste it in and adapt it. Or, for example, the other day I was playing around with a Python script and I was like, I don't know how to read in this JSON file whilst doing some like type assertions and stuff like that. So I would get it to explain it to me. So it's more like a little bit of kind of a coding assistant. To be honest, if I was doing like coding professionally, I would probably spend more time on getting that set up properly so that it integrated with Neovim or VS Code or whatever editor I was using. But I don't do it enough professionally to like justify spending the time on like getting it all perfectly.
Okay, I lost it for a second, but you're here again. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I can hear you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yep, I can.
Great.
Okay. And are you working on any other projects that you want to share with someone watching?
Not too many kind of sort of personal projects at this stage. I mean, like I said earlier, I am kind of sort of dabbling with the idea of doing a YouTube channel, but I'm still trying to figure out what ideas and what stuff I want to do there. So nothing kind of to publicly announce. I did mention earlier I have kind of one other Neovim plugin, right? So if you kind of go up into my GitHub username, so you'll see I've got another plugin here called wrapping.nvim. It does need a bit of attention, I will warn you. So if anyone's feeling on like trying this out, you're more than welcome, but it hasn't had any maintenance in a little while, so it might be a little bit more rough around the edges than Debugprint. Essentially what this was supposed to do was this is supposed to deal with the fact that things like markdown files, for example, sometimes have soft or hard kind of wrapping modes, like soft or hard wrapping endings. And wrapping.nvim is designed to automatically detect that and then like change the relevant Neovim settings to kind of handle that automatically, which is something surprisingly that Neovim doesn't do out of the box. But like I say, it probably needs a little bit of kind of sort of love and care and updating. There's a few issues that need attention there and so on. It should still work. So if folks are interested in trying it, by all means, please go and try it. And if you're interested in using it or it's not working for you, again, please open an issue. Maybe that'll motivate me to give it a bit more attention. But that's one thing. It's not really a project, but if folks are interested in seeing my Neovim dot files, you can take a look. If you go into my dot files repo, this is actually my dot file for all kinds of stuff, not just Neovim. So if you go into this directory here, stow, and then you go down to, where are we, if command, it's a little bit kind of hidden, and then down here to nvim, that's where all my Neovim kind of dot files are. So if you're interested in seeing what I'm doing there, then you can have a look in that if that's interesting. So that's kind of the main stuff that I have going on.
Okay, wonderful. You mind sharing 3 of your favorites terminal tools or TUIs or CLI tools, whatever?
Yes, I do. So I already mentioned kind of one of them, which is LF, right? So, I'm opening up on the wrong screen there, so you won't be able to see that. Let me just try and do that on the right screen. There we go. So hopefully you can see that in the window. So I already mentioned one of them, LX. So like I said, this is just a kind of a file manager. I've spent a little bit of time kind of customizing that for my needs. If you're interested, the dot file for that is in my dot files repo as well.
Okay.
Another one that I use sometimes that's maybe a little bit less well known is a thing called Entr, ENTR. So if you go, I'll show you by example. So if you go into, here's for example, the Debugprint repository on my in my home directory, where Lazy checks it out. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is the Debugprint has some unit tests. So if I just run make, it will run the unit tests for Debugprint. And hopefully they'll all pass. Yep, they did all pass. That's great. So, Debugprint's working. But when I'm developing on Debugprint, one of the things I sometimes want to do is repeatedly run those unit tests, right? Because that's kind of the whole point of having automated testing. So one of the things I'll do is I'll use Entra to set that up. So what you can do is you can basically say find dot, right? So probably as many people will know, if I just run find dot, that will list all of the files under the Debugprint repo. So I can do find dot, and then I can pipe that into Entra, and I can type make. And what that will basically do is it will watch all of those files, right? Every single one of them. And if any one of them changes, it will rerun the make command, which in this particular case is like synced up to basically run the unit test, right? So if I just run that, the first time it will run make. If I then open up another terminal window, and maybe let's put them side by side so that you can see what's going on a little bit more clearly. If I go back into the Debugprint repository, that's the wrong place. If I go back into the Debugprint repository, let's say, for example, let's modify the README, right? Because obviously that's not going to actually change anything in the code, but, it's still changing some contents of the repo. So if I change the README and press right quit, you'll see it reruns the tests over here, right? So basically this is like a really easy way of like, I'm changing some code, or maybe I'm changing one of the tests. Every time I change something and I write and quit, it reruns the whole test suite over there on the left. But you can generalize this concept, right? So it's not just for running tests. That's just how I happen to be using it here. Basically, any command that you have that will like create a list of files on your file system, Entra will then find is quite a convenient way of doing that, but there's obviously many other ways. Entra will then watch that entire list, and anytime any of those files changes, it reruns the command that comes after Entra, which in this case is make, which reruns the test. So it's quite a useful general command for like watching stuff and doing stuff.
Oh, that is a pretty interesting tip. Thank you for that. Okay. Any other one?
Immediately comes to mind. No.
Okay. That's fine. Do you have 3 favorite Neovim plugins?
3 favorite Neovim plugins. So I didn't have a list prepared, but let's take a look in my top files and see what I can suggest for you. Let me just clear up my screen a little bit. So let's go and take a look in my Neovim configuration. So the way my Neovim configuration is structured, and again, by the way, this is all public, so if anyone's interested in looking at any of this stuff, you can just go to my GitHub repo for my dot files. So you can see I actually use quite a lot of Neovim plugins. I always used to like to say that I was quite a Vim minimalist, but it turns out I'm actually not. I've got quite a few. So let's see, what have I got in here? So one of the interesting ones is, I'm trying to see if there's anything particularly unusual in here that folks watching this may not have come across before. One of the ones I quite like is capture. It's really simple, right? But basically, if I'm in Neovim, if I do something like, I don't know, for example, let's think of a good example. If I type highlight here as a command, it will print out all of these different highlight groups, and it does it in a way where it's kind of a really annoying pager where you can only go down. It's quite old school. In fact, there is a Neovim issue, I think, to fix that. But one of the things you can do is you can type capture highlight with this plugin installed, and it will then capture all that and it will put it in a buffer. Now, actually, in this particular, that was quite a bad example because the whole point of the highlight thing is to have them all printed out with different colors. And of course, it hasn't actually honored that. So that's maybe not the best example I could have used, but still, like, capture is kind of pretty helpful sometimes. Let's see what else is kind of sort of particularly interesting. Oh, so one of the other interesting ones, I actually only started using this recently, is this thing called Quicker, which is quite interesting. So what it enables you to do is you can do things like, let's say I'm in my .files directory, for example. So let's change, so the current directory is my .files. And then let's grep for, I don't know, the word plugin. I'm sure that's in there plenty of times. It is. Right, so now that I've grepped for the word plugin, it's found all of those and it's put them into a quick fix window. Probably many of the people using this, watching this video will be familiar with the quick fix window, but just in case you're not, this is kind of like a sort of standard old school Vim thing, right? That basically kind of, allows you to capture basically kind of files and lines. And so in this particular case, it's taken the output of grep and it's put that into this quick fix window, right? So I can navigate up and down between those different, all the different places that it's found the word plugin across the whole of my .files repo. So that's great, right? So I'm just pressing, next bracket Q to just kind of navigate up and down through my quick fix window. So that's fine. But then what this quicker plugin also allows me to do is to basically manipulate the quick fix window. So let's say, for example, now having done that search on the word plugin, what I want to do is I actually want to replace everywhere in this file where it says the word plug with the word banana, right? So I'm just using sort of a standard Vim search and replace within the quick fix list buffer. So I'm replacing the word plug with the word banana, and I'm going to put the C option on here as well, which allows me to confirm it. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, that's a bit of a shame. That should have worked, I think. I wonder if the plugin's not working. Oh, there we go. There we go. I sort of cheated by changing it, but it may be that there's a bug with the plugin. It's not my plugin, so I'm gonna disclaim responsibility there. But the idea is supposed to be that I can basically now manipulate this buffer, and once I save those changes, it's a little bit like oil. Once I save those changes, they will actually be reflected in the original files, right? So if I go through and I replace it with banana here, not here, not here. I can basically use any Vim command I want, edit this buffer in any way I like, and then when I press write, it should reflect those in the original file. But obviously this plugin isn't quite working right for some reason. I'm sure it's a good plugin. Maybe I just haven't got it set up right or something. Maybe need to do some debugging offline. But that's kind of the idea, is that it enables you to actually edit quick fix buffers and then make changes to them. But clearly it's not working right for some reason. Oh, and then this one is completely frivolous and a little bit silly, but I quite like it, and it's called Tiny Glimmer. So basically what it does is it kind of animates your yanks and puts and so on and so forth. So if I yank that line, hopefully, I don't know how well this is coming out over YouTube and over the recording because it's quite a smooth animation, but hopefully you'll at least get the idea. If I yank that line, it kind of highlights and flickers it. And then if I paste it down here, you can see it sort of zooms into space. It probably on the recording it may look a little bit more janky than it would in real life, but you kind of get the idea. So yeah, there you go. There's three off the top of my head. I mean, there's if you're interested in seeing what other plugins I'm using, then by all means look in my .files. But that's kind of the idea.
Okay, wonderful. And what are your thoughts on home labs?
What are my thoughts on home lab? I wouldn't go so far as to say I have a home lab, but I have a home 2 servers. I do quite a lot of sort of self-hosting of stuff. For example, I kind of sort of self-host my own iCal server for my calendar, that I use with my iPhone and stuff like that. What else do I self-host? I self-host an ad blocker and stuff like that. So I mean, I have for my whole network. I mean, so I have 1 or 2 servers that I kind of have running at home, but I wouldn't say I'm majorly into that. Just enough basically for kind of what I need. It's not. I'm more of a software guy than a hardware guy. Let's put it that way, right? So they're nothing fancy. They're just those little mini ITX are they called? I think the little Intel Nux, N-U-Cs, that's the word I'm looking for. I don't even know how you pronounce it, but yeah, just those kind of little boxes. They're nothing particularly powerful.
Oh, you run a hypervisor on them or just straight Linux?
No, I just run Debian on them directly. I mean, these days people seem to be getting more and more into running things like Proxmox and stuff like that on them, and I've certainly heard about that, but so far it's not something I've been particularly interested in doing. So yeah, I just run Debian on them directly on bare metal.
Okay, wonderful. You want to share, to end the call, two of your favorite music bands?
Yeah, so music, I have a diverse and eclectic kind of musical interest, I guess I would say. But, as of recent years, I'm quite into my metal. So things like Nine Inch Nails, Metallica, things of that nature, like fast stuff that kind of sort of helps me like stay in the zone and focus when I'm working, basically. So things like that. But I'm no like musical expert guru. I just kind of like what I like, basically.
Okay, wonderful. And what about movies?
Cheesy 80s Hollywood action stuff. So like, Die Hard, Beverly Hills Cop, that kind of stuff. That's the kind of thing I like,
Did you ever watch...
Just pre-CGI, pre-CGI basically is kind of like my genre. Sorry, did I ever watch?
Yeah, did you ever watch White Man Can't Jump?
I have not seen it. Is it good?
Hold on, let me see. I like the movie. My wife hates it. This one. Hold on. Where's my screen? There we go. This one.
Yeah, Woody Harrelson and
Wesley Snipes.
Wesley Snipes, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a old movie,
Yeah.
I don't know. I just like it. But
okay.
Yeah.
I'll check it out. I'll stick it on the list.
Yep. And video games? Are you into video games or no?
I'm not a huge video gamer. I guess I'm probably what some people might kind of derogatorily call like quite a casual gamer. I'll play my, tower defense games on my iPad and stuff like that. I'm not like a big gamer in the way that some people are. I've sometimes, kind of got into things like Doom and stuff like that for a while. But yeah, again, it's all like fairly old school stuff. I'm not one of these people who buys like some huge fancy rig with the very latest GPU to download. So that's not me.
Okay, wonderful. So any final words before we wrap it up, Andrew?
No, not really. Just to say, firstly, thank you for inviting me and for talking to me about this. And for anyone watching this, I hope you found this kind of useful and interesting. I'm always happy to chat to anyone about Neovim. You probably the best way to reach me, certainly through in debug print context, is kind of through issues or pull requests on the repo, right? So if you want to provide any feedback, features, bugs, that kind of type of thing, by all means go that way. You can also find me on Reddit. I think my Reddit username is Andrew FZ, if I'm not mistaken. So you can reach me there as well if you kind of want to talk to me in another context. But yeah, so thank you very much. I really appreciate the time chatting to you today and talking through Debugprint and some other things. I hope folks found it useful and interesting.
No, yeah. Thanks to you for your time and for reaching out. Because thanks.
Yeah, and thanks for setting up the call, Chris, and thanks for sorting this all out.
Okay, wonderful. Nice to meet you. I'll talk to you later,
Nice to meet
Andrew.
you too. Cheers. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.